People like you do not get to question people like me. That was the first thing Vanessa Whitmore said that made the entire room go quiet. And it was also the moment I realized the president of the Briarwood Crest Homeowners Association had absolutely no idea who she was talking to. My name is Ryan Caldwell, and 3 weeks earlier, I had moved into my late grandfather's house at the quiet end of Hawthorne Lane. Compared with the newer homes surrounding it, the place was almost painfully modest. 2 stories, faded brick, an attached garage, and an oak tree that had probably been standing there longer than half the neighborhood. I drove a 7-year-old pickup truck, wore work boots more often than dress shoes, and had no interest in impressing anyone. Apparently, that was enough for Vanessa to decide exactly where I belonged in the neighborhood hierarchy. I first met her at the monthly association meeting inside the Briarwood Crest Clubhouse. She was impossible to miss. Vanessa was a heavy-set woman in her late 50s, wearing a bright red designer jacket, oversized gold earrings, and enough expensive accessories to make the folding chairs around her look even cheaper. She sat at the center table with the confidence of someone who believed the room belonged to her. About 40 homeowners were present when she announced what she called an emergency community improvement assessment. Each property owner would be expected to pay $18,400 toward a major renovation of the clubhouse and surrounding recreational facilities. A few people gasped. One man near the back immediately raised his hand and asked how soon payment was required. Vanessa smiled as if she had anticipated the question. She said the association's bank had already approved the financing structure and that homeowners needed to cooperate quickly so the project could proceed without complications. Then she mentioned possible liens against owners who failed to meet their obligations. That was when I looked down at the packet sitting in my lap. I had spent enough years reviewing contracts and financial documents to recognize when important information was missing. The packet referred repeatedly to bank-approved financing, but I could not find a loan number, closing date, named loan officer, or executed commitment letter. There was plenty of confident language, just very little information supporting it. I raised my hand. Vanessa noticed me and sighed before calling on me. Which bank officer authorized these terms? I asked. Her expression changed slightly. The board has handled the financing, she replied. That was not my question, I said. The notice says the bank has approved the arrangement. I am asking who at the bank approved it. Several people turned toward me. Vanessa leaned back in her chair. Mr. Caldwell, you have lived here for what? 3 weeks. 22 days. A few nervous laughs moved through the room. Vanessa did not laugh. Then perhaps you should spend some time understanding how Briarwood Crest operates before challenging people who have served this community for years. I looked back at the packet. I am only asking about a statement printed on page 4. Her face tightened. She glanced around the room and then gave me a smile that seemed designed for an audience rather than for me. Some people move into a neighborhood like this and immediately imagine they have influence because their name appears on a deed. You are a new homeowner, Mr. Caldwell. You are nobody here. The room became painfully still. I could feel several neighbors watching me, waiting for an argument. I did not give Vanessa one. Instead, I folded the packet carefully and placed it beside my chair. What she did not know was that my grandfather, Walter Caldwell, had been involved with Briarwood Crest long before Vanessa ever joined its board. Decades earlier, when much of the surrounding land was still undeveloped, he had helped provide financing connected to the original development. I had boxes of his records sitting in my garage, including old agreements, correspondence, property maps, and banking documents I had barely started reviewing. None of that made me more important than anyone else in the room, and I had no intention of using my grandfather's history as some kind of social weapon. But it had taught me one useful lesson. Important financial claims usually leave important financial records behind. Vanessa continued the meeting and moved quickly to the next agenda item. I stopped asking questions. Instead, I listened. She repeated that the financing was approved. Then she said it was finalized. A few minutes later, she described the assessment as necessary to satisfy the bank. Those were 3 slightly different claims, and I wrote each one down. When the meeting ended, homeowners gathered around Vanessa while I walked quietly toward the exit. At the door, I opened the packet one more time and studied the financing notice under the bright hallway lights. The document looked official. It sounded official, but the 4 things I expected to see were still missing: a bank officer's name, a loan number, a closing date, and an executed commitment reference. I slipped the packet into my jacket instead of throwing it into the recycling bin near the door. Vanessa had spent the evening making sure everyone understood that I was nobody. I was beginning to wonder why she needed everybody to believe the bank had said something that the paperwork itself could not prove. The $18,400 bill arrived 4 days after the meeting, tucked inside an envelope stamped Final Assessment Notice in large red letters. I stood at my kitchen counter reading it twice while my coffee went cold beside me. Payment was due within 30 days. The notice claimed the money was necessary to satisfy financial requirements connected to the clubhouse renovation and warned that unpaid assessments could eventually result in collection action permitted under the association's governing documents. That wording was more careful than Vanessa Whitmore had been at the meeting. She had made it sound as though the bank itself was waiting for $18,400 from every homeowner. The letter merely said the assessment was connected to financial requirements. Those were not the same thing. I placed the notice beside the packet I had saved and opened the digital folder of Briarwood Crest records available to homeowners. I was not trying to prove Vanessa had committed some dramatic crime. I wanted to understand why I was being asked to write a check larger than the price of my first car. The declaration gave the association authority to levy certain assessments, but major special assessments required specific procedures. The bylaws described board votes, notices, meeting requirements, and record-keeping obligations. I downloaded everything available from the previous 12 months and started building a timeline. By midnight, the problem was no longer just missing bank information. The numbers themselves were behaving strangely. One set of meeting minutes described the clubhouse project as a preliminary proposal estimated at roughly $2 million. 3 months later, another document referred to an expanded project approaching $3 million. The newest assessment packet suggested homeowner contributions were necessary alongside bank financing, but it never clearly explained how much the bank was supposedly lending, how much cash the association already held, or how the $18,400 figure had been calculated. Briarwood Crest had fewer than 150 homes. Even a rough calculation put the assessment total well into 7 figures. I searched for a detailed budget explaining where that money would go. I found glossy renderings of a renovated clubhouse, a larger fitness room, landscaping improvements, and an upgraded pool deck. I did not find a clean financial schedule tying those improvements to the amount homeowners were being charged. The following afternoon, I walked across the street to return a package that had accidentally been delivered to my neighbor, Linda Mercer. She was standing on her porch with the same assessment notice in her hand. "You got yours too?" she asked. I nodded. Linda lowered her voice. "My husband wants to pay it immediately." Vanessa said waiting could put the house at risk. "Did anyone explain how they calculated the amount?" I asked. Linda shook her head. Vanessa said the bank required it. There it was again. Not the association. Not the board. The bank. I told Linda I was reviewing the documents before paying and left it at that. I did not want rumors spreading based on questions I had not answered yet. By the end of the week, however, Vanessa had apparently decided rumors were useful. A neighbor I barely knew stopped me near the community mailbox and said he had heard I was organizing residents to refuse the assessment. I told him that was not true. Another homeowner asked whether I was planning to sue the association. That was not true either. On Saturday morning, an email from Vanessa appeared in the community mailing list. She did not mention me by name, but the target was obvious. She warned residents against taking financial advice from newcomers unfamiliar with established community obligations and repeated that delaying required payments could create unnecessary costs. I read the message at my grandfather's old desk, then printed it and added it to the growing folder. Vanessa seemed determined to turn a request for documentation into a personality contest. I had no interest in competing. That afternoon, I pulled 3 cardboard storage boxes from the back of my garage. They contained my grandfather's old Briarwood Crest papers, some dating back nearly 30 years. Most were irrelevant to the current assessment, but they helped me understand how carefully the original development agreements had been documented. Loan correspondence identified lenders. Amendments carried dates. Financial commitments had reference numbers. Important decisions left trails. I returned to the current records and noticed something I had overlooked. 2 documents referring to the proposed financing included a scanned signature attributed to a senior bank executive. At first glance, That seemed like exactly the verification I had been looking for. Then I opened an older set of board minutes and checked the dates. The signature appeared on a document dated February 12th. According to the association's own minutes, the board had not formally authorized Vanessa to pursue that financing proposal until April 3rd. I stared at the two dates for a long time, making sure I had not misunderstood them. Then I checked again. February 12th, April 3rd, nearly 7 weeks apart, and in the wrong order. I still did not know what the explanation was. There could have been preliminary discussions. There could have been an earlier authorization recorded somewhere else. There could have been a simple administrative mistake. I refused to turn uncertainty into an accusation. But I knew exactly what I needed next: the original financing records. I sent a short written request to the association asking for the board resolutions, relevant financial records available for homeowner inspection, and documentation supporting the $18,400 assessment. I kept the language neutral and specific. Vanessa responded 43 minutes later. Her entire answer was only 2 sentences. The financing documents were confidential, she wrote, and further requests on the subject would serve no legitimate community purpose. I printed that email too. Then I placed it directly behind the February document bearing the bank executive's signature. Vanessa thought she had closed the subject. Instead, she had just given me another reason to keep looking. Vanessa's refusal bothered me less than the word she had chosen to justify it: confidential. If homeowners were being charged $18,400 because of a financing arrangement, then some records supporting that decision should have existed somewhere in the association's files, even if private banking details were properly withheld. I spent Sunday morning organizing what I already had instead of sending another angry email. By noon, my dining table was covered with meeting minutes, assessment notices, project summaries, and financing references arranged by date. The February 12th document sat in the center. It carried what appeared to be the signature of a senior bank executive named Charles Bennett beneath language suggesting the bank was prepared to support the renovation financing. The April 3rd minutes said the board had authorized Vanessa to pursue formal financing options. That sequence did not automatically prove anything improper, but it demanded an explanation. I searched every set of minutes available between January and April. There was no recorded vote authorizing a financing agreement before February 12th. There was only a January discussion describing the clubhouse renovation as an idea requiring further study. On Monday morning, I sent Vanessa a second request. This time I narrowed it to records showing board authorization for financing discussions before February 12th and the non-confidential portions of any commitment supporting the special assessment. I also asked how the $18,400 amount had been calculated. Her reply arrived that afternoon. Mr. Caldwell, your continued attempts to interfere with board business are becoming disruptive. The board is under no obligation to satisfy your personal curiosity. I read that sentence twice. Then I saved the email without responding. That evening, Linda Mercer knocked on my door. She looked uncomfortable and held a printed copy of the assessment notice. We paid it, she said. My husband did not want trouble. I invited her into the kitchen, where most of the documents were still stacked neatly on the table. Then you should not feel bad about paying it, I told her. I am not telling anyone to withhold money. I am trying to understand what the money is for. Linda looked at the February document. Vanessa told us the bank would not release the renovation loan unless everyone paid. That was stronger than anything written in the assessment notice. When did she say that? I asked. At the Finance Committee meeting last Thursday. I wrote down the date, but I did not treat Linda's recollection as proof. The next morning, I requested the minutes from that committee meeting. There were none posted yet. 2 days later, the association announced another homeowner meeting for the following Tuesday. The stated purpose was to address questions concerning the assessment. Vanessa's email emphasized that the board wanted to stop what she called misinformation circulating in the neighborhood. By then, I had found another problem. The same scanned signature attributed to Charles Bennett appeared on 3 different documents. I enlarged them on my computer and compared the placement. Each signature looked identical, down to a tiny upward stroke at the end of the last name. That alone was not suspicious because organizations reuse authorized electronic signatures all the time. What caught my attention was the surrounding language. One document described preliminary financing. Another referred to anticipated approval. The newest one was being presented in the assessment packet as support for financing that Vanessa publicly described as finalized. 3 documents, 3 different levels of certainty, 1 identical signature. I made copies and placed them in chronological order. At Tuesday's meeting, nearly every chair in the clubhouse was occupied. Vanessa entered wearing a bright emerald jacket, a patterned silk scarf, and a large gold bracelet that clicked against the table as she arranged her papers. She spent the first 10 minutes assuring everyone that the renovation was financially sound. Then she looked directly at me. "Since one resident seems determined to create confusion," she said, "perhaps we should settle this tonight." I raised my hand. "That would be helpful." Vanessa's smile sharpened. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Nothing," I said. "I am asking a question. Was the bank financing fully approved before the special assessment was issued?" "Yes," she answered immediately. A few residents turned toward me. "And the bank has verified the documents supporting it?" I asked. "Absolutely, including the February 12th document." For the first time that evening, Vanessa paused. It lasted barely a second. "Every relevant document has been properly handled." I nodded and closed my folder. I could have mentioned the April authorization. I could have displayed the 3 identical signatures. Instead, I asked one final question. "Then may I inspect the board authorization that allowed the financing process reflected in that February document?" Vanessa leaned toward her microphone. "No, and this discussion is finished." I looked around the room. Several homeowners were no longer watching me. They were watching her. I had entered the meeting with a date problem and a signature question. Vanessa had just added something much more useful, a clear public statement that the bank had verified everything. All I needed now was for her to say it where she could never later claim we had misunderstood her. Vanessa gave me exactly what I needed 6 days later, and she did it because she was more interested in embarrassing me than protecting herself. The association announced another meeting after homeowners continued asking questions about the assessment. By then, I had stopped being the only person requesting records. Linda Mercer wanted a detailed project budget. A retired accountant named Robert Hayes asked for the financing schedule. 2 other homeowners requested the board vote supporting the final assessment amount. Vanessa responded by calling the meeting a community financial briefing. I arrived early and took a seat near the middle of the clubhouse with 1 folder and a legal pad. I deliberately left my grandfather's old Briarwood Crest documents at home. His history had nothing to do with the question in front of us. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes later wearing a cream-colored designer coat over a bright purple blouse, jeweled glasses, and a gold necklace large enough to catch the overhead lights whenever she moved. She greeted several board members warmly, then looked toward me as though she had found an unpleasant stain on the carpet. The meeting began with a presentation about the clubhouse renovation. Vanessa showed architectural renderings, landscaping plans, and photographs of outdated exercise equipment. What she did not show was a signed loan agreement. When questions opened, Robert asked how much financing the bank had committed. Vanessa answered without giving a number. Linda asked whether the assessment had been a condition imposed by the bank. Vanessa said the bank expected the association to demonstrate sufficient homeowner participation. Again, the wording shifted. I wrote it down. Then Vanessa looked directly at me. "Mr. Caldwell, I assume you have another theory for us tonight." "No theory," I said. "Just one request." "Of course. At the previous meeting, you stated that the bank had fully approved the financing and verified the supporting documents. I would like that statement included in the official minutes." Her smile disappeared. "The secretary records whatever is appropriate." "Then this should be easy. Is your statement still accurate?" The room became quiet. Vanessa leaned back and crossed her arms. "You seem unusually obsessed with this issue for someone who has barely lived here a month. The association sent me a bill for $18,400. I think asking what supports it is reasonable." A few homeowners murmured in agreement. Vanessa glanced toward them and then back at me. "Some residents understand that maintaining property values requires investment. Others move into communities they may not be financially prepared to afford." I knew exactly what she was doing. "Are you saying I cannot afford the assessment?" "I am saying your behavior suggests that possibility." Robert shifted in his chair. Linda stared at Vanessa. I kept my voice even. "My finances are not on tonight's agenda. The bank financing is. Has the bank fully approved the arrangement you described to homeowners?" Vanessa leaned toward the microphone. "Yes." Has the bank verified the documents you relied upon? Yes. And you are comfortable having both statements recorded in the official minutes? She gave a short laugh. Absolutely. Perhaps seeing it in writing will finally end this nonsense. The association's secretary looked uncertain, but typed something into her laptop. I waited until she finished. Then I closed my notebook. Vanessa apparently expected another argument, but I had nothing else to ask. For the rest of the meeting, I listened while she repeatedly described the project as secure and the assessment as necessary. 2 days later, draft minutes appeared in the homeowner portal. I opened them from my grandfather's desk and scrolled to the discussion section. There it was. President Vanessa Whitmore confirmed that bank financing had been approved and that supporting financing documentation had been verified by the bank. I downloaded the file immediately. Then I printed a copy and placed it beside the February 12th document. Vanessa had spent weeks telling everyone I was confused, uninformed, and too new to understand Briarwood Crest. Now I did not need to argue with her interpretation anymore. Her claim had become part of the association's written record. The next morning, I called the bank using the public number on its official website. I did not ask for private account information. I explained that I was a homeowner who had received an assessment notice containing representations about financing connected to my property obligations, and I wanted to know the proper process for verifying the specific references in those documents. After 2 transfers, a representative gave me the name of the department that handled institutional lending inquiries and explained what documentation I could submit. I looked at the folder beside me. For the first time since Vanessa had called me nobody, the question was no longer whether I believed her. The question was whether the bank did. The bank did not give me the dramatic answer Vanessa probably imagined I was trying to obtain. In fact, the first thing they told me was what they could not tell me. I had no authority to inspect Briarwood Crest's private banking records, no right to demand account balances, and no access to confidential loan negotiations simply because I owned a house in the community. That was exactly what I expected. What mattered was whether the references printed on documents sent to homeowners corresponded to the financing Vanessa had publicly described. Following the bank's instructions, I submitted copies of the assessment notice, the February 12th document, and the portion of the approved meeting minutes containing Vanessa's statement. I removed unrelated homeowner information and explained that I was not requesting confidential account details. I wanted verification of representations attributed to the bank. 3 business days passed without an answer. On the 4th morning, a woman from the bank's institutional lending department called me. Her name was Margaret Sloan. She carefully explained that she could not discuss any existing relationship between the bank and the association beyond information the bank was authorized to confirm. Then she asked me to read the financing reference printed on the assessment notice. I did. There was silence while she checked something. Mr. Caldwell, she finally said, I can confirm that this reference does not identify an executed loan commitment matching the financing terms represented in the material you provided. I sat straighter in my chair. So you are saying there is no HOA loan? I am not saying that, Margaret replied immediately. I am saying the specific reference you submitted should not be represented as an executed commitment under the terms described in your documents. The distinction mattered, and I wrote her words down carefully. Can the bank confirm whether the February document represents final approval? Another pause. Not from what you have provided, and you should not interpret that document as confirmation from us that a final loan closed on February 12th. That was enough. I thanked her and asked whether the bank could provide a written response limited to those points. She said she would determine what could be released. I hung up without calling a single neighbor. Vanessa had told an entire room that financing was fully approved and the bank had verified the supporting documents. The bank had just told me not to interpret the material that way. But a phone conversation was not something I wanted to turn into neighborhood gossip. I needed records, not excitement. The written response arrived electronically the following afternoon. It was brief and cautious. The bank declined to disclose confidential information, but confirmed that the financing reference in my assessment material did not constitute evidence of an executed commitment matching the terms represented to me. I printed 2 copies. Then I went back through the HOA records again. With the bank's language in front of me, details that had seemed merely confusing began to form a pattern. The February document referred to preliminary financing considerations. A March project summary described lender discussions as ongoing. The April 3rd minutes authorized Vanessa to pursue formal financing. Yet by the time the special assessment was issued, homeowners were being told that bank approval was already secure. I still could not say whether Vanessa had deliberately lied or simply overstated negotiations. Intent required evidence I did not have. What I could say was that her public certainty did not match the paperwork. That evening, Linda stopped me near my driveway. "Did you hear back from the bank?" she asked. I hesitated. They confirmed that the reference we were given is not proof of the executed financing Vanessa described. Her face changed. "We already paid. That does not mean the money is gone or that the assessment is automatically invalid," I said. "It means we need proper records before anyone jumps to conclusions." Linda nodded slowly. "Then what happens now?" I looked toward the clubhouse at the end of the street. We asked together. By the next afternoon, 7 homeowners had signed a written request for the records supporting the assessment, including board resolutions, project budgets, non-confidential financing documentation, and the calculation used to reach $18,400 per property. Robert Hayes reviewed the wording before we submitted it. We made no accusations. We demanded no private bank information. We simply asked the board to show the basis for a 7-figure collection from homeowners. Vanessa responded the following morning. This time, her email was not dismissive. She announced that the board would review the requests with association counsel and provide an appropriate response. For the first time, she did not mention misinformation, troublemakers, newcomers, or my ability to afford Briarwood Crest. I placed her email beside the bank's letter. Vanessa had spent a month trying to make the story about me. The bank had quietly moved the story somewhere she clearly did not want it to go, back to the documents. Vanessa waited 8 days before answering our records request, and when the response finally arrived, it contained more pages than information. The association uploaded a folder filled with architectural proposals, contractor estimates, landscaping concepts, equipment lists, and copies of meeting minutes we already had. What it did not contain was a signed loan commitment matching the financing Vanessa had described, a clear calculation supporting $18,400 per home, or any board resolution showing that finalized financing existed when homeowners were told it did. Robert Hayes called me that evening. "She gave us 100 pages of paper and somehow avoided the 3 pages that matter," he said. "Then we do not assume why," I replied. "We identify what is missing." Robert laughed softly. "You really refuse to make this dramatic. The documents are doing a decent job without my help." The next morning, the 7 homeowners who had signed the first request sent a follow-up identifying the missing records by category. By afternoon, that group had grown to 19. Linda circulated the request without adding rumors or accusations, and that mattered. People who had initially avoided me were beginning to ask the same basic question. If the assessment was justified, why was explaining it so difficult? 2 days later, the board's treasurer, Martin Cole, sent a message to all homeowners. It was the first communication about the project that did not come through Vanessa. Martin wrote that, because of questions concerning the project's financial documentation, he supported an independent review before additional renovation funds were committed. Vanessa responded less than an hour later, stating that the project remained properly authorized and that delays could increase costs. She also introduced a new explanation. The financing, she wrote, had always been a developing arrangement subject to final documentation. I read that sentence several times. It was reasonable language by itself. It simply did not match what she had told us earlier. I opened the approved meeting minutes where she had confirmed that bank financing was fully approved and supporting documentation verified. Then I placed her new email beside it. Robert came to my house that Saturday, and we spent 2 hours comparing the records. He noticed something I had missed. A contractor proposal for approximately $2 million had been replaced months later by a broader package approaching $3 million, but the board minutes contained no detailed discussion explaining several added project components. Another document showed that certain design and consulting expenses had already been authorized before the special assessment was collected. None of that automatically meant the spending was improper. It did mean the association needed to explain how the project had expanded and who approved each stage. On Monday, Martin announced that the board had voted to engage an independent accounting firm to review the project records, assessment calculation, and authorization history. Vanessa's name appeared at the bottom of the notice, but the language was noticeably restrained. The review took nearly 2 weeks. During that time, I did not contact the bank again, and I did not dig through Vanessa's personal life. This was never about finding dirt on her. It was about statements made in an official capacity concerning homeowners' money. When the preliminary findings were circulated to the board and made available to homeowners in summary form, they answered one question and created 3 more. The reviewers found that the clubhouse renovation had evolved through multiple proposals without a single consolidated financial schedule showing homeowners how the final assessment amount had been derived. They also identified inconsistencies between board minutes, project summaries, and communications describing the status of financing. Most importantly, they could not locate an executed bank commitment in the association records that supported Vanessa's earlier statement that financing had already been fully approved at the time she made it. That did not prove there had never been discussions with the bank. It proved the association's own files did not support the certainty homeowners had been given. The next morning, Vanessa sent another community email. This time she said her previous statements had been informal explanations and that some residents might have interpreted them too literally. I almost admired the wording. Almost. I opened the official minutes from the meeting where I had asked her specifically whether the financing was fully approved, whether the bank had verified the supporting documents, and whether she wanted those statements recorded. There was nothing informal about it. That afternoon, a new notice appeared in my mailbox announcing a special board meeting for Thursday evening. The stated purpose was to review the independent findings and address homeowner concerns. At the bottom was a sentence I had not seen in any previous notice. Representatives associated with the financing review had been invited to provide clarification. Linda called me as soon as she received hers. "Do you think Vanessa knows what they are going to say?" she asked. I looked at the bank's letter on my desk, then at Vanessa's approved statement in the minutes. "I think she knows what she said," I replied. Thursday night. Everyone else may finally learn whether the bank ever said it too. By 7 o'clock Thursday evening, the clubhouse parking lot was full, and people were standing along the back wall because every chair had been taken. I arrived with one folder under my arm and sat beside Linda Mercer and Robert Hayes. Vanessa Whitmore was already at the board table wearing a bright blue designer jacket with gold trim, matching earrings, and the same confident expression she had worn when this began. But something had changed. She was no longer controlling the room alone. Martin Cole sat 2 seats away with the independent review summary in front of him, and beside the association attorney was a man introduced as Daniel Foster, a senior commercial lending officer from the bank. He was not there to discuss private accounts or confidential negotiations. Martin made that clear before questions began. Daniel had been invited to clarify what the bank could confirm about the documents and representations homeowners had received. Vanessa opened with a prepared statement. She said the renovation had always involved a complicated financing process and suggested that certain phrases used during earlier meetings had been misunderstood. Then she looked toward me. Unfortunately, speculation by a small number of residents has created an impression that the board misrepresented the project. I did not respond. Martin did. That is why we asked for independent clarification. Vanessa's expression tightened. The accounting reviewer spoke first. She explained that the association's files contained proposals, preliminary financing communications, project estimates, and board discussions, but the review had not located an executed bank commitment supporting the statement that financing was fully approved when Vanessa said it was. She also confirmed that the calculation behind the special assessment had not been presented in a single, complete financial schedule. Then Martin turned to Daniel. "Can you clarify the bank's position without discussing confidential information?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, I can address documents attributed to the bank and explain what they do and do not represent." Vanessa reached for her microphone. "Before we continue, I think it is important to recognize that preliminary approval is commonly understood as approval subject to documentation." Daniel looked toward her politely. "Those terms can have specific meanings, Mrs. Whitmore. That is why I would prefer to describe the documents themselves." The room became completely quiet. He explained that the February 12th document reflected preliminary communication related to a potential financing structure. It was not an executed loan agreement. It was not confirmation that funds had been committed. Most importantly, It did not establish that the bank required every Briarwood Crest homeowner to pay $18,400 as a condition of releasing a finalized loan. Linda inhaled sharply beside me. Someone behind us whispered, "Then why were we told that?" Vanessa immediately leaned toward her microphone. "Nobody said the bank directly ordered individual homeowners to pay." Robert opened his copy of the earlier minutes. I did the same. Martin looked at Vanessa. "The concern is broader than that. The approved minutes state that you confirmed financing had been fully approved and supporting documentation had been verified by the bank." Vanessa shook her head. "Those minutes summarize a lengthy conversation. Context matters." That was the moment I finally raised my hand. Martin recognized me. "Mr. Caldwell." I stood but stayed beside my chair. "I do not want anyone relying on my interpretation. Could Mr. Foster answer one question?" Daniel nodded. "If I can. Based on the February document and the financing reference distributed with our assessment notice, did the bank consider the financing fully executed at the time President Whitmore told homeowners it was fully approved?" Daniel paused before answering. "No. Those materials do not establish an executed financing commitment at that time." I sat down. Nothing else needed to be added. Vanessa tried anyway. She explained that negotiations had been progressing positively and that she had used ordinary language to reassure homeowners. Martin asked why later communications had repeatedly described the financing as secure. Vanessa said she had relied on conversations and expectations surrounding the project. The association attorney quietly reminded the room that no conclusion about intent should be drawn until the board completed its review. That mattered to me. A false statement and a misunderstanding could look similar until the records showed why it happened. I was not interested in turning uncertainty into a criminal accusation. Then the accounting reviewer introduced the next issue. Several project expenses had been approved while financing was still preliminary, and the sequence of approvals needed further examination. Some invoices corresponded to design work and consulting services added as the project expanded from roughly $2 million toward $3 million. Martin announced that additional commitments related to the renovation would be temporarily suspended while the board reviewed authorization procedures and the assessment calculation. A homeowner near the front asked what would happen to residents who had already paid. The attorney said the funds would remain accounted for while the board determined the proper corrective process. Vanessa stared down at her papers. For the first time since I had met her, she was not explaining Briarwood Crest to everyone else. Everyone else was asking her to explain herself. As the meeting ended, Daniel gathered his documents and spoke briefly with the association attorney. I was halfway to the door when Vanessa called my name. I turned. "You seem pleased with yourself," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "I am pleased we finally asked the bank instead of arguing about what the bank supposedly said." She looked at me for several seconds, but offered no answer. I walked outside with Linda and Robert. Behind us, homeowners were still gathered around the board table. The $18,400 assessment had started this fight, but the money was no longer the biggest question. Now the board had to determine why preliminary financing had been presented as certainty, who had authorized spending while that financing remained unsettled, and whether Vanessa's changing explanations could survive the rest of the paper trail. The answer arrived 11 days later, not in a dramatic confession, but in a 46-page financial review that made Vanessa's explanations harder to defend with every page. The board released the report to homeowners after association counsel removed confidential banking information and personal data. I downloaded it at my grandfather's desk and read it from beginning to end before calling anyone. The central finding was careful but unmistakable. Briarwood Crest had been discussing renovation financing with the bank, but the discussions had remained preliminary during the period when Vanessa repeatedly described the financing to homeowners as fully approved. There had been no executed commitment supporting that level of certainty. More importantly, the bank had never imposed an $18,400 payment on each homeowner as a condition for releasing a finalized loan. The assessment had been an association decision developed as part of the board's own funding strategy. That distinction changed everything. Vanessa had repeatedly invoked the bank when homeowners questioned urgency, making a board decision sound like an external requirement that residents had little choice but to accept. The report did not accuse her of fraud. It did something more useful. It reconstructed the timeline. In January, the clubhouse renovation had been discussed as a project estimated near $2 million. In February, preliminary lender communications began. During March, additional design features and consulting services expanded the proposed cost. On April 3rd, the board formally authorized Vanessa and the treasurer to continue pursuing financing options. Yet some communications distributed afterward referred to lender support in language stronger than the underlying documents justified. Then came the assessment. The reviewers also examined the 3 documents bearing Charles Bennett's identical signature. The signature itself was not found to be forged. It had been an authorized electronic signature appearing on bank correspondence generated through standard procedures. That closed one question without manufacturing a scandal where none existed. The problem was how the correspondence had been characterized after it reached the association. Preliminary communications had gradually been described as evidence of finalized financing. The spending review raised a separate concern. Several design and consulting expenses had been approved as the project expanded, but the documentation supporting those approvals was inconsistent. Some expenses had proper authorization. Others required the board to determine whether internal approval procedures had been followed correctly. Again, the report did not claim anyone had stolen money. It recommended further review, stronger controls, and a complete reconciliation before additional project funds were spent. Robert called while I was still reading. Page 31, he said immediately. I turned to it. An email from Vanessa to 2 board members had been summarized in the review. She had written that presenting the assessment as necessary to keep financing on track would reduce resistance among homeowners. That sentence stopped me. It still did not prove she intended to deceive anyone, but it showed she understood how strongly the financing argument could influence people. 2 nights later, the board held another special meeting. Vanessa arrived wearing a black designer suit with a bright gold scarf, but the usual performance was gone. Martin Cole presented a motion to suspend the renovation project until the finances and approval history were fully reconciled. The motion passed. Then he introduced a second motion directing Association Council to evaluate the assessment process and determine appropriate options for money already collected. That passed too. Vanessa objected that the board was overreacting to imperfect wording. Every large project involves evolving negotiations, she said. Martin looked down at the report. Evolving negotiations are not the issue. The issue is whether homeowners received an accurate description of where those negotiations stood. Vanessa turned toward me. And all of this started because one man decided he knew better than the people elected to run this community. I did not answer immediately. Then I said, it started because the documents did not match the explanation. A homeowner near the front asked Vanessa directly why she had told residents the financing was fully approved. She said she had believed approval was effectively assured based on the progress of discussions. Another homeowner asked why she had allowed the official minutes to record her statement after I specifically asked whether it was accurate. Vanessa said she had not anticipated that ordinary conversational wording would later be treated as technical banking language. That answer did not satisfy the room. Near the end of the meeting, Martin announced that several board members had requested a formal vote regarding Vanessa's continued role as president under the association's governing procedures. The vote would occur after the required notice period. There was no cheering. I was glad there was not. This was not a victory parade. Neighbors had paid serious money because they trusted information from people elected to manage their community responsibly. As everyone began leaving, Linda walked beside me toward the parking lot. You knew something was wrong from the first meeting, did you not? She asked. No, I said. I knew something did not add up. There is a difference. Across the room, Vanessa stood alone at the board table gathering her papers. A month earlier, she had called me nobody because she believed authority belonged to whoever occupied the biggest chair. The financial review had exposed a simpler truth. A title could give someone authority to speak for an organization. It could not make the records agree with what that person said. 3 weeks later, Briarwood Crest held the quietest board meeting I had attended since moving into my grandfather's house. There were no architectural renderings on the screen, no speeches about property values, and no warnings about homeowners standing in the way of progress. The first item was the renovation assessment. After reviewing the independent financial report and advice from Association Council, the board voted to withdraw the existing assessment structure and suspend the clubhouse project until a new budget, financing plan, and approval process could be presented transparently to homeowners. Residents who had already paid, including Linda and her husband, would receive their money back under a refund process established by the association. Any future renovation proposal would require a detailed cost schedule showing exactly what homeowners were being asked to fund. The second item concerned Vanessa. Under the procedures in the governing documents, the board voted to remove her from the presidency. She remained entitled to whatever rights the bylaws provided regarding her board position, but she would no longer control the office she had used to speak for the association. Vanessa sat at the end of the table wearing a white designer jacket, a patterned scarf, and expensive gold jewelry. For once, she said very little. Martin Cole became interim president while the board prepared for the next regular election. Then he announced 3 changes recommended by the Financial Review. Major financial representations would require supporting documentation before being communicated as final. Significant project expenditures would receive documented approval. Homeowners would receive clearer financial summaries before extraordinary assessments were imposed. None of it sounded exciting. That was precisely why I liked it. Good governance was supposed to be boring. When the meeting ended, Martin stopped me near the door. "Ryan, several people think you should run for president." I laughed because I thought he was joking. He was not. "You understand the records better than most of us," he said. "And people trust you now." I looked around the clubhouse. Linda was talking with neighbors who, only weeks earlier, had been afraid that questioning the assessment might put their homes at risk. Robert was discussing the new review procedures with the treasurer. "I appreciate it," I said, "but I do not want the chair." Martin looked surprised. "After everything that happened?" "Especially after everything that happened. This community does not need another person who thinks the title makes them the smartest person in the room. It needs procedures strong enough that the title does not matter." He smiled and shook my hand. Outside, Vanessa was standing beside a luxury sport utility vehicle when I crossed the parking lot. She watched me approach, then glanced away. I could have kept walking, but she spoke first. "I suppose you got what you wanted." I stopped several feet away. "What do you think I wanted?" "To prove me wrong." I thought about the first meeting, the assessment notice, the missing loan information, the February document, and all the neighbors who had been told the bank had effectively left them no choice. "I wanted to know what supported an $18,400 bill," I said. That was always the question. Vanessa adjusted the scarf around her neck. "You embarrassed this association." "No. The records embarrassed the explanations." She looked at me for a moment, then opened her vehicle door. I continued toward my truck. There was no dramatic final confrontation because there did not need to be one. The assessment was being corrected. The renovation had been paused. The finances were being reconciled. And the board had finally established rules designed to keep preliminary discussions from being presented as settled facts again. A few days later, I returned the last of my grandfather's old documents to their boxes. At the bottom of one folder, I found a letter he had written during Briarwood Crest's early development. One sentence caught my attention: "Authority should always be easier to verify than to trust." I smiled and closed the box. My grandfather had helped finance part of this community decades before Vanessa ever became president. But in the end, that history had not been what exposed the problem. I had never needed his name, his influence, or some hidden claim to power. I had needed a packet of documents, a few reasonable questions, and enough patience to let inconsistent statements meet an independent record. Vanessa had been right about one thing when we first met. In Briarwood Crest, I really was nobody. I held no office. I controlled no board. I had no special vote. But that turned out to be the point. You should not need power to ask someone in power to prove what they are telling you. So what would you have done in my position? Would you have paid the assessment to avoid trouble? Or would you have kept asking questions until the numbers finally made sense? If stories like this remind you why one careful question can matter more than the loudest title in the room, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next one.